choosing the right advisor can make or break your career. I'm not kidding about that. I have been around long enough to see people be in less than ideal situations because of the advisor they chose. And so in today's video, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks that you can use when you are choosing a PhD advisor, especially if you're about to enter into a PhD program, thinking of applying to a PhD program, or you're already in a PhD program but you haven't chosen your advisor yet. My name is Dr. Gertrude Nontra. I have a PhD in microbiology and immunology, and I make these videos for you. Tip number one is to make sure that your research interests are aligned with the potential advisor's interests. Now, this is fairly easy to do these days. You can go onto most university websites, find the faculty on there, and usually they'll have a page dedicated to them with their research interests, with their publications, and so on. And so this is fairly easy to do. This will also mean that you've done some introspection to kind of think of where you want to be or what kind of research you want to do as you enter into this PhD program. Now, I will say that this was a mistake that I personally made. I had an idea of what I wanted to do. I really wanted to study the host response to pathogens. This was what I really wanted to do. My PhD program didn't necessarily have that or have like infectious diseases as a program, but I did end up in the lab of somebody who was doing the host response to a particular pathogen. It was a slightly different area, but it was still really interesting. I got papers out of it, so it ended up being a really good experience. So you really have to sit down and think about, okay, what kind of research do I want to do? Not just the subject, but within that, what are you interested in, right? And then you're going to find somebody that has research interests that are aligned with that or adjacent to that. The second tip is to not be afraid to have conversations with students and postdocs that have been in the lab before you, all right? And it's important that when you're having these conversations, you don't go in with rose-colored glasses. What do I mean by that? A lot of us, when we're accepted into PhD programs, we're so excited to become Dr. So-and-so, and so we may go in and say, okay, no matter what, like I'm going to like crush this PhD program, which you are, but I think it's really important for you to pay attention to what people say about the PhD program as a whole and about some of the faculty that you may be interested in working with. And I think that this is really, really important because it will help you learn things like, does this person value me having work-life balance? This is a huge problem in academia, right? So I remember that there was this one faculty member way back in my grad school days who did not give his PhD students and postdocs vacations. He didn't believe in vacations. He believed that Saturday and Sunday was enough. And that was going to be a problem for me, so I ended up not working in that person's lab. But, if vacations are important to you, if taking a break is important to you, then maybe this is something you pay attention to. During my PhD program, I've talked about it on this channel before, I got pregnant and I was off of work for about 6 or 7 weeks, right? Are people going to be open to that, being your reality? Some people are open to it. Some people literally, like I remember there was this, I can't remember the scenario, but there was this situation where I think there was a graduate student that got pregnant and somebody who said, well, if she was really serious about her doctorate, she wouldn't go and get pregnant. And I'm like, who says that? Who says things like that? Like we're grown adults. We're not like little teenagers in high school. We are PhD students. If she wants to start a family now, what's so wrong with that? So there are people that kind of have prejudices against getting pregnant, raising a family, so it's really important for you to sort of listen out for that and, listen out for those nuances, because if you don't, then you find yourself in such a situation, you may have a really miserable time. Again, I'm so thankful for my PI. In hindsight, so many good things did happen to me in my PhD program. But my PI was so supportive because she was a mother herself, and we made a joke once that between the two of us, by the time I finished my PhD, between the two of us, we had 3 babies, so she was really supportive of the whole pregnancy. I worked all the way until I think the 38th week of my pregnancy. The week I left my lab, like my boss actually was the one, my PI was the one who was like, you should not come to work anymore, you're too pregnant. Yeah, the week after I stopped working, I had my baby, so she was supportive the whole way through, supportive of me having a little bit of time off, and that's not always a situation, so that's something to pay attention to. I think another thing that's really important to take a look at is the publication record of this potential advisor. Now, I did want papers by the time I was done with my PhD, and so it was important to me to choose an advisor who would want the same thing. I find that when advisors are younger and they want to progress in their career, they're more likely to have the motivation to publish. And that was my situation. This was a new PI, so she had that impetus to like keep on moving so that she could get her tenure. And then even there are people that after they get their tenure, they're just driven and motivated to like publish regularly so that they contribute to that body of knowledge. But then you can really have situations where people now have tenure and they're not as motivated to publish. This is a reality that also can exist. And so this is again important for you to take a look at. You can go and look at people's publication records online and see, when was the last time they published a paper. I find that if this person is publishing at least 1 paper each year, that can usually be a really good sign. But if it's been 5 years since they published their last paper, well, a lot of PhDs in the US are 5 to 6 years. So does that mean that you're not going to get a paper in your PhD? So these are things that you should pay attention to. I think you should pay attention to anyway, especially if you want publications, because as much as like I've talked about this before as to whether you need or don't need papers, especially if you're not going to be working in academia. And for me, it wasn't such a big deal, but maybe for you it is. Maybe for your purposes, it's important for you to have publications, right? I did have publications. Maybe for you it's not, depending on whatever. But let's say you want publications, right? Make sure that you are going into a situation or into an advisor and student relationship where that will be encouraged, where that will be supported, where that will be pushed forward. Because also you can have situations where you have a paper and advisors will sit around on it for years and not publish it. So this is something to pay attention to as well. Funding is a really important conversation to have with your advisor before you start a program. Now, so far I've talked about kind of doing your own sleuthing work, to, your own investigations to find out all of this. But when you finally sit down with that potential PI, it's absolutely important for you to have that conversation with them. Am I going to have enough funding for my whole PhD? Some PhD students go into these programs with funding already. If that's you go on with your bad self, right? But if you're going to depend on your advisor or on the school for funding, this is a really crucial conversation. During my PhD, I did see people whose advisors lost funding whilst they were PhD students or the funding ran out, and that became a really dire situation. When I was a postdoc, right, one of the reasons the main reason I lost my job was because funding ran out. It's a real situation that happens to researchers. Funding can run out. So it's always important for you to have that conversation. Am I going to have enough funding? And if that PI is honest, right, and you can say, please be honest with me, right? They may tell you, well, I have funding for the next 2 years, but I am going to need you to generate this data within the next 2 years so that I can use that to apply for more funding. Or they may tell you that, I have funding for you for all the time you're here. Or they may say, I have funding for you for this amount of years, but you're going to have to apply for extra funding. So really understand what the funding situation is as you enter into that PhD program. And I'm speaking specifically about funded PhD programs. I know some PhD programs are not, but especially for those of us in the biomedical sciences, this was, most of the time our PhDs were funded. And it's absolutely important for you to understand the real situation on the ground before you start, because it will be a shame for you to just end up having to finish with your master's degree just because you didn't find out about that financial situation. And some people, some advisors will tell you off the bat, and some will not tell you until you ask. And so if you don't hear that come up in conversations, please ask. Communication style. Consider this person's communication style, and what the expectation will be of you. Will you have to meet with them weekly to give them weekly updates on the data you're generating? Are they more hands off? What is their communication style? Depending on who you are, one may work for you and another may not. So this is also really important to understand, right? Yes, we're not going to be 100% aligned on every single thing, but I really think that if you understand that, okay, my PI expects me to have a figure a week, right? A figure a week. Then you know that every day you come into the lab, you're working on an experiment that will give you one figure to show your PI, or one paragraph to show, like, whatever it is, right? So those expectations, like, set them from the beginning. It definitely helps to reduce like disappointment with each other later on, right? So that's really something to understand. And then I'll say, trust your instincts, right? So you're doing all this investigation, you're asking these questions, you're looking at all these things, but also trust your instincts, right? Sometimes people can look one way and they end up being another way, and a lot of things could lead up to that, right? So if you don't feel right about something, if something doesn't pass that gut check, trust it, or you feel those things and you say, well, in spite of it, I'm gonna move on anyway. But and then so when you see it down along the line, you won't be so surprised, right? I hope that was helpful. Let me know in the comments below where you're watching this video from, number one, and number two, which one of these are you going to use as you choose a PhD advisor?